June 4, 1944, Kiel, Germany. A heavy fog blanketed the Baltic coast as the German Navy launched U-2511, the first of a new breed of submarines, the Type XXI. Beneath its sleek hull and minimal wake hid a terrifying leap in underwater warfare. It wasn't just faster than anything the Allies had at sea. It was quieter, more agile, and it could stay submerged for days without surfacing. To American and British naval intelligence, it was almost mythical, and they wouldn't truly understand it. Not for another year, until they crawled through the wreckage of a ruined Reich and realized how far behind they'd been. The Type XXI wasn't just a new submarine. It was a redefinition of naval combat. Before 1944, submarines were little more than submersible torpedo boats, surfacing frequently, using diesel engines in the open, and diving only to attack or escape. Even American Gato-class subs in the Pacific, deadly as they were, spent more time on the surface than underwater. German U-boats, too, hunted on the waves until radar, depth charges, and Allied air superiority turned the ocean's surface into a graveyard. Nazi engineers responded not with armor or firepower, but silence. The Type XXI was the first true submarine in the modern sense, powered by revolutionary batteries that gave it days of submerged range and built in modular sections inside hidden underground factories. It could cruise underwater at 17 knots, faster than most Allied destroyers could track. Its hull was hydrodynamically perfected to reduce sound and drag. It was equipped with a schnorchel, a retractable breathing tube, that let it draw air and run diesel engines just below the surface, hidden from aircraft. More importantly, the electric motors ran whisper-quiet, using suspended mountings to isolate vibration and muffle sound. In the final months of the war, only 2 Type XXI subs ever made it to operational status. One was sunk before it could attack. The other, U-2511, was patrolling the North Atlantic, fully prepared to attack a British cruiser, when word of Germany's surrender came. The captain obeyed orders, veered off, and disappeared silently beneath the waves. America had won the war, but when naval intelligence boarded captured Type XXI hulls in Norway and Germany in May 1945, a chill ran through the steel spines of every officer present. The U.S. hadn't just missed a new class of submarine, it had missed the next era of undersea warfare entirely. The scramble to catch up began instantly. The U.S. Navy towed the captured U-2513 and U-3008 across the Atlantic. Engineers, metallurgists, and sonar experts dissected every inch. Their conclusion was humbling. German subs were quieter, better at depth control, and far harder to detect. Even the Allies' best sonar gear, the pride of Atlantic convoy defense, would have struggled to track a Type XXI cruising at full speed beneath the thermocline. But copying brilliance is never easy. The U.S. Navy initiated Project Guppy, Greater Underwater Propulsion Power Program, in 1946. It aimed to retrofit the aging American submarine fleet with German innovations, sleek hulls, larger batteries, snorkels, and quieter motors. Engineers pored over the Type XXI's streamlined form and reverse-engineered the curved pressure hull that gave it its strength. The results were significant. Guppy boats could stay submerged longer, move faster, and detect targets farther. But they weren't silent, not like the Germans had been. The reason wasn't incompetence, it was manufacturing philosophy. German Type XXI subs were built in prefabricated sections in inland factories, using precision-machined components meant to fit without vibration. Their electric motors used advanced balancing techniques and were mounted with layered dampening materials that American manufacturers couldn't yet replicate. Even the Germans' cables and piping were routed to minimize echo and flow noise, a level of design detail the U.S. Navy had never needed to consider during wartime production. In America, submarines had been built fast, quantity over nuance. Welding techniques left subtle imperfections. Hull shapes weren't optimized for acoustic flow. Even the metals used, thicker, more rigid American steel, created more noise at high speeds underwater. The U.S. could mimic the form of the Type XXI, but not the silence. The problem haunted naval war games for years. In 1949, President Truman himself toured the U-2513, now a training platform in Key West, Florida. Naval officers demonstrated its capabilities, but even then, its stealth impressed more than anything built domestically. The sub was decades old, but it still moved through the water like a ghost. By the 1950s, the Cold War was heating. The Soviets, too, had captured German subs and copied the Type XXI into their Whiskey-class designs. Underwater warfare was entering an arms race of silence. The U.S. responded with nuclear power. A revolution of a different kind. But the ghosts of German silence still lingered in every sonar, contact that couldn't be tracked. Even the first American nuclear submarine, the USS Nautilus, launched in 1954, was louder than a Type XXI. Faster, yes. Longer range, yes. But quieter, not yet. The pursuit of silence eventually led to breakthroughs in anechoic tiles, isolated machinery, and quieting protocols. But it would take decades before an American sub could match the underwater stealth of a late-war German design built under bombardment and desperation. And so, in the grand balance of naval warfare, the story of the Type XXI remains a sobering lesson. Speed, firepower, and technology win battles. But silence wins the ocean. Even today, somewhere in the deep, the legacy of that German ghost still echoes in sonar rooms, a reminder that sometimes the most dangerous weapon is the one you never hear coming. November 27, 1945, Portsmouth Naval Shipyard, New Hampshire. Snow dusted the rusting conning tower of U-2513 as U.S. Navy engineers swarmed around the captured sub like archaeologists around a buried temple. This was no museum piece. It was a weapon that had terrified Allied convoys without ever firing a shot. Inside, Chief Petty Officer Mike Riley ran his hands along the pressure hull. "Feels like it's carved, not welded," he whispered. "It's too smooth." He wasn't wrong. What baffled American experts wasn't just the innovation, it was the precision. The Type XXI had tolerances tighter than anything American wartime factories had achieved, even at their peak. Every valve, hatch, and turbine housing was designed to limit acoustic signature. Not just to work, but to disappear under sonar. But the U.S. Navy didn't have time to admire craftsmanship. It needed answers. Fastraith. By early 1946, the Office of Naval Intelligence had launched Operation Deadlight Reclamation, a quiet operation to recover as many intact German submarines as possible before they were scrapped, scuttled, or stolen. The Soviets, too, had their eyes on the prize. Germany had lost the war, but its submarines were about to win another. American engineers dismantled U-2513 piece by piece. Some sections were sent to Electric Boat in Groton, Connecticut, others to naval research labs in Washington. Every pipe bend, battery cell, and vibration damper was catalogued. But reproducing them was like trying to replicate a symphony by reading a broken sheet of music. The Germans hadn't just built a better submarine, they had changed the definition of what a submarine was. Before, subs surfaced to fight. Now, they disappeared. A hunter that vanished beneath the noise floor. The U.S. had plenty of firepower, torpedoes that could punch through a battleship's armor, sonar that could scan 100 miles. But they didn't matter if the enemy could vanish before detection. This triggered what internal memos called the silence crisis. The U.S. was loud and vulnerable. The Type XXI proved it. Admirals called emergency conferences. Naval think tanks spun up classified panels. Project Guppy was rushed through congressional review with little oversight, fueled by a single fear. If the Soviets copied this technology faster, the Atlantic would belong to Moscow within a year. The first retrofitted American subs, Guppy-1 conversions, looked promising. They got snorkels, sleeker hulls, and upgraded batteries. But when sonar teams tested them at sea, disappointment hit hard. The hydrodynamics weren't quite right. The electric motors, American-made, still produced harmonic vibrations, and the snorkel mast echoed like a drum in rough waves. Worse, the internal machinery, pumps, gear shafts, turbines, all hummed just enough to be detected by Cold War sonar arrays. German subs had ghost signatures. American ones had fingerprints. By 1948, the problem was so severe that classified reports began recommending the U.S. reevaluate its entire submarine doctrine. At a secret naval conference held in San Diego that October, Rear Admiral Willard Smith summarized the issue bluntly. "The German subs we captured could hear us coming 10 minutes before our best sonar could hear them. That's not a disadvantage. That's suicide." To compensate, U.S. engineers began developing active noise cancellation, inspired by aircraft muffling tech. They poured money into rubber mounting systems, magnetic motor suspensions, and non-metallic pipelinings. But the irony stung. Germany, bombed into ruins, had built the world's quietest submarine. America, flush with steel, money, and manpower, couldn't match it. By the time the Soviets launched their own Type XXI knockoffs, the Whiskey class, in 1950, the silence race had gone global. American intelligence estimated that within 5 years, Russian subs could park off New York undetected if the U.S. didn't develop a counter-solution. The Cold War, some said, didn't start with nuclear bombs. It started with a whisper in the deep. A German whisper. A German whisper. And the U.S. had to learn how to hear it, or risk never hearing the attack that would end it all. February 18, 1951. North Atlantic, 0300 hours. A U.S. destroyer, USS Charles P. Cecil, was running sonar drills off the coast of Iceland when the operator froze mid-sentence. A contact, faint, clean, gliding at 12 knots, had appeared on his screen. Then, without warning, it vanished. No turbulence, no noise, no echo, just gone. To the bridge, it looked like a malfunction. But to the men down in sonar, it was something worse. A Type XXI signature. Only this time, it wasn't German. It was Soviet. By 1951, the United States had learned a painful truth. The Soviets had not only captured German submarine plans, they had captured German engineers. Dozens of them had been quietly moved east after the war, working under guard in shipyards near Leningrad and Gorky. There, they rebuilt the Type XXI on blueprints, improving the batteries, lengthening the hull, and christening it the Whiskey class, the Soviet Union's first true underwater predator. And unlike Germany, the Soviets had no shortage of steel or manpower. By 1957, they had built over 200 of them. To the Pentagon, it was a nightmare. America had copied the Type XXI to gain an edge. But now the enemy was mass-producing it. The ocean had become an invisible chessboard, where every move was hidden by silence. The U.S. Navy's Submarine Force Atlantic scrambled to respond. New anti-submarine destroyers were built, fitted with the latest sonar arrays. But the truth was humiliating. The U.S. could detect its own subs more easily than it could detect the Soviet ones. That winter, American naval researchers began studying not German design, but German thinking. the ruthless logic that had created the Type XXI under fire and starvation. They realized that silence wasn't a byproduct of engineering. It was a philosophy. The Germans had designed from the inside out, not the outside in. Every bolt, bearing, and cable was treated as a potential source of sound. They had calculated how a drop of oil rolling off a bearing could alter the sub's acoustic footprint. In the U.S., design still started with comfort, efficiency, and modularity. Silence was an afterthought. That realization triggered what historians now call the Quiet Revolution of 1952. At a classified facility in Carderock, Maryland, American engineers created a new field, acoustic engineering, dedicated entirely to measuring and eliminating underwater noise. They built the world's first underwater sound labs, studying how propellers hummed, how hulls resonated, and how flow noise could betray a vessel hundreds of miles away. Every revelation seemed to confirm what Nissen's huts had once proved in another field. Sometimes, brutal simplicity outperforms sophisticated complexity. Meanwhile, the Soviets were turning silence into a weapon. Their Whiskey-class boats, improved into the Zulu and Romeo classes, began shadowing American convoys, surfacing in Atlantic fog banks, just close enough to be seen, a deliberate psychological game. To Washington, it wasn't just provocation, it was proof that the ocean was no longer American territory. In 1955, an incident occurred that the Navy buried for decades. During NATO exercises off the Norwegian coast, the submarine USS Redfin reported tracking what appeared to be a Soviet Whiskey-class boat at periscope depth. For 6 hours, the contact stayed ahead, never visible, never traceable, until sonar operators realized the impossible. The contact wasn't in front of them anymore. It was beneath them, cruising silently just under the thermocline layer, using the same hydrodynamic tricks pioneered by the Germans. It could have fired. It didn't. It simply disappeared into the black. The incident, codenamed Operation Dead Wake, sent shock waves through naval intelligence. The United States had nuclear warheads, aircraft carriers, and global bases. But in the one domain that couldn't be seen, it was being outplayed by sound. And so the Americans doubled down. The Navy built experimental subs, USS Albacore, AGSS 569 being the first, inspired directly by the German Type XXI's hull lines. It was rounded, teardrop-shaped, and engineered purely for silent speed. Tests in 1953 shattered all expectations. The Albacore didn't just move fast underwater, it moved smooth. It sliced the sea like glass. The project would birth the next generation, the nuclear-powered Skipjack class, and eventually the USS Nautilus. But even as American subs grew faster and stronger, silence remained their most elusive prey. Deep in the Pentagon's classified archives, an internal report from 1954 contained one chilling line. "We can now stay submerged forever, but they can still hear us before we hear them." That line haunted the Navy for decades, because in the Cold War's darkest hours, when nuclear subs prowled beneath the Arctic ice, carrying enough firepower to erase continents, it wasn't the weapons that terrified the admirals, it was the silence that came before them. January 17, 1955. Groton, Connecticut. The air was frozen, but inside the control room of the USS Nautilus, the tension was electric. Captain Eugene Wilkinson flipped the switch and broadcast the first message in submarine history to be powered by an atomic heart. Underway on nuclear power. It sounded like progress. It was a warning. The Nautilus didn't just represent a new generation of submarines, it marked the dawn of permanent invisibility. Powered by a Westinghouse S-2W reactor, the Nautilus could remain submerged for months, cruising beneath continents, untouchable by storms or radar. It was a leap beyond what the Germans had ever imagined. But as it slid beneath the surface that cold January morning, a new problem descended with it, one the Americans still hadn't solved: noise. Despite its silence on the surface, Nautilus was loud underwater. The steam turbines, necessary to drive the nuclear-powered propulsion system, vibrated against the hull like a heartbeat in a cathedral. Its speed was unmatched, but its acoustic signature rang like a bell across Soviet sonar nets. What good was endless endurance if the enemy could hear you coming? The Soviets knew this weakness. By the late 1950s, their own nuclear submarines, the November class, were noisier, yes, but they used that time wisely. They perfected passive sonar, tuned to frequencies that American engineers hadn't yet shielded against. It wasn't brute strength that kept the Soviets up at night. It was a ghost they'd once captured in Germany and renamed Whiskey. Back in Washington, the Navy faced a bitter truth. Nuclear power gave submarines infinite lungs, but still no stealth. And now, the missile age was upon them. In 1960, the USS George Washington launched the first Polaris ballistic missile from beneath the Atlantic. It was a technological miracle, a steel ghost, hundreds of feet long, armed with nuclear warheads, surfacing only to destroy nations. But to the Pentagon's ears, the missiles weren't the scariest part. It was the idea that the Soviets might build something quieter, and they were getting close. In a brutal irony, the Soviet Union, despite its backward civilian economy, became the world's most obsessed acoustic spy state. Their listening stations lined the Arctic. Their trawlers, disguised as fishing boats, dropped sonar buoys off the coast of California. Their submarines operated in total silence drills, often cutting power entirely and gliding using battery reserves alone. They had copied the Type XXI philosophy and learned a valuable lesson. You don't win by launching first. You win by being the only one left. So the U.S. had to pivot. No more just copying German designs. They needed to outdo them. In 1963, that ambition gave birth to what many call the first true stealth submarine, the USS Thresher. Streamlined, optimized for silent cruising, filled with new damping materials and quieting tech, Thresher was the pride of the fleet, and the most advanced sub ever built. Until April 10, 1963, when it sank. During deep-diving tests off Cape Cod, Thresher suffered a sudden systems failure and imploded at crush depth. 129 crew lost, gone in under a minute. The Navy's investigation found poor welds, a failed pipe fitting, and a silent electrical fault that went unnoticed until it was too late. That silence, so carefully engineered, had betrayed them. The accident shattered confidence. Navy Command wondered aloud if they were pushing too hard for silence at the cost of survivability. But the Cold War didn't pause for grief, because in the Barents Sea, Soviet submarines were getting quieter. By 1968, the U.S. launched the Sturgeon class, fast, deep-diving, and far quieter than anything in their arsenal. But it was still playing catch-up to an acoustic standard set in Nazi Germany. Even with exotic soundproofing materials, polymer-lined pump systems, and rubber-damped propeller shafts, silence still had to be measured in decibels and in seconds before detection. The Cold War wasn't about who could shoot first. It was about who could hear last. In this era, both sides began deploying deep-sea sound surveillance systems, known as SOSUS. Stretching thousands of miles across the ocean floor, these hydrophone arrays listened for that one deadly whisper. But even SOSUS had a limit. When submarines slowed to less than 5 knots and ran silent, they were ghosts. You couldn't track them. You could only wait to see if they launched. It wasn't until the 1980s, 40 years after Type XXI's birth, that American submarines finally surpassed the silence of the German original. The Los Angeles-class attack subs, and later the Sea Wolf redefined silence in the ocean's black. But by then, the lessons had taken root. In the halls of the Pentagon, silence had become a doctrine, not a detail. And in the world beneath the waves, it had become currency, traded not in speed or steel, but in seconds of undetectability. And at the center of that doctrine, in every acoustic design diagram and sonar training simulator, was a blueprint from 1944, stamped in German, and curved like a shark's spine. The race for silence had reached a deadlock. American submarines were finally quieter. Barely. But they still couldn't predict where Soviet boats would go, or when they'd strike. And in war, stealth without intelligence was just blind silence. So the U.S. changed the game. Instead of chasing noise, they decided to listen to secrets. It started with a rumor. In late 1967, U.S. Navy cryptologists intercepted fragmented Soviet naval communications about an undersea cable running across the Sea of Okhotsk, a cold, shallow, heavily defended body of water just east of the Russian mainland. It connected a major Soviet naval base on the Kamchatka Peninsula with headquarters in Vladivostok. Unlike radio, which could be intercepted, this cable carried hardwired voice traffic, direct, unencrypted orders between admirals. It was gold. If it could be tapped. The problem? The Sea of Okhotsk wasn't international water. It was a Soviet fortress. Sub-hunting aircraft crisscrossed the skies. Patrol boats swept the coastline. Submarines were tracked constantly. No American vessel had dared enter it. Until now, the mission was called Operation Ivy Bells. Led by the USS Halibut, a retrofitted, nuclear-powered spy submarine. The operation pushed naval engineering into science fiction. The Halibut carried deep-sea diving drones, robotic arms, and magnetic claws that could operate in total darkness 400 feet below the surface. And, more importantly, her hull was shrouded in soundproofing, so quiet she could glide above the seabed like a shadow. The task: find the Soviet cable, intercept it, and tap it without leaving a trace. They did. Somewhere beneath the Sea of Okhotsk, Halibut deployed a wiretap the size of a torpedo. It clamped around the cable and recorded every word that passed through, and it worked perfectly. For 10 years, U.S. intelligence listened to Soviet admirals discussing fleet movements, missile tests, sub-deployments, raw, unfiltered intelligence that shaped Cold War policy in real time. And the Soviets had no idea. But the mission was only possible because of one thing: silence. Every pass required Halibut and later submarines to navigate acoustic minefields. Soviet sonar nets lined the sea like tripwires. If the sub made so much as a metal ping or pressure ripple, it would be cornered and destroyed. The Navy trained crews to breathe quietly, to walk slower, to time tool use with undersea currents. Engineers redesigned torpedo tube doors just so they wouldn't click underwater. Every wiretap deployment was an act of underwater theater, and silence was the script. But in 1981, the play ended. A former NSA employee named Ronald Pelton, drowning in debt and bitterness, sold the details of Operation Ivy Bells to the Soviets for $35,000. He didn't just betray the tap, he revealed the method. Soviet divers recovered the device. Within weeks, Moscow rerouted its naval cables. They also released a propaganda statement accusing the United States of violating their territorial waters. The mission was dead, but its legacy wasn't. Ivy XXI Bells wasn't just a spy operation. It was a monument to silent warfare. The entire mission had been made possible because U.S. submarines had finally mastered what German engineers had pioneered in 1944. How to move unheard, how to hide in the water itself, how to be everywhere without being anywhere, and even in failure. It revealed something the Soviets feared most: Not American missiles, not American carriers, but American silence, because silence, once perfected, wasn't just stealth, it was power. In a world filled with satellites, spy planes, and real-time surveillance, it's easy to think silence is no longer a strategic asset. That noise, in the digital age, can be masked, decrypted, or filtered. But beneath the oceans, in that cold, dark, pressure-crushed world, nothing has changed. Down there, silence still wins. By the 1990s, the Soviet Union had collapsed, but Russia's submarine legacy remained. So did its obsession with sound. They built the Akula class, fast, deep-diving, and, for the first time in Russian history, quieter than its American counterpart. Western intelligence didn't see it coming. Literally. One Akula slipped into the Atlantic in 1995 and vanished. For 3 full weeks, the U.S. Navy had no idea where it was. SOSUS didn't pick it up. Satellites didn't see a wake. It appeared again near the East Coast before returning to Russian waters. No confrontation, no message, just a demonstration. It was a reminder. The race wasn't over. The United States responded the way it always had, with innovation. The Navy launched the Seawolf class, designed to crush everything that came before. Its engines ran so quietly they were nicknamed ghost drives. Its sonar could pick up a screw falling off a fishing trawler. Its hull, coated in special acoustic tiles, absorbed sonar like black velvet. It was fast, deadly, and cost over $3 billion per unit. But by then, the enemy wasn't just other submarines. It was detection itself. Sonar had evolved. AI-based tracking systems were being tested. Chinese and Russian navies were investing heavily in quantum magnetometers, which could, in theory, detect a submarine by the minute fluctuations it causes in the Earth's magnetic field. The ocean was becoming transparent, and yet, the American answer wasn't louder engines or bigger torpedoes. It was something much older, much simpler. Quieter boats. In 2004, the Virginia-class was introduced, sleeker than Seawolf, cheaper to build, but still armed with decades of lessons in silence. These boats didn't just avoid detection, they manipulated it. Their hulls were shaped not to reflect sonar, but to bend it, redirecting echoes away like light through glass. Their systems were designed so even the coolant pumps couldn't be heard. Inside them, everything is engineered for stealth. Footsteps are cushioned. Doors close with magnetic seals. Even the air filtration units, once the loudest thing on a sub, are now whisper quiet. But the biggest threat isn't what's in the water anymore. It's what's watching from above. Today, nations are launching underwater drones, artificial intelligence sonar buoys, and long-range acoustic detection satellites. They're trying to map the invisible, to catch the ghosts, and yet, even now, when a U.S. Navy Virginia-class submarine glides under the Arctic ice, there's one thing no algorithm can predict: complete acoustic silence. It's not just quiet. It's absence, a moving void, a weaponized nothing. In war games, when these submarines go dark, enemy fleets often resort to dropping sonar bombs randomly, hoping to force a reaction. They rarely get one. The submarine doesn't surface. It doesn't retreat. It just waits, because the men inside know what Peter Nissen knew in 1916. You don't win by being louder. You win by being first, and being gone. The great irony? After a century of advancement, after nuclear propulsion and AI navigation, every single submarine in the U.S. fleet still owes its advantage to one German design: a curved hull of corrugated steel, welded in secret during the dying days of the Reich. Type XXI didn't win the war, but it defined the one that never ended. Somewhere in the South China Sea, in waters charted by satellites but unknowable beneath the surface, an American attack submarine drifted silently beneath an archipelago of disputed reefs. It wasn't looking for targets. It was listening. In the past decade, U.S. intelligence analysts began flagging something strange. Chinese submarines, once mocked by Western navies for being deafening, crude, and decades behind, were vanishing from sonar screens. Not for minutes, not for hours, for days. They had learned to whisper. China's naval rise is no longer a prediction. It's a statistic. In 2005, the People's Liberation Army Navy, PLAN, had 0 nuclear ballistic missile submarines on patrol. Today, it has dozens of advanced submarines, both nuclear and diesel-electric, equipped with increasingly sophisticated quieting technology. And U.S. officials knew exactly how that happened, because some of it was stolen. In 2007, the Department of Justice quietly indicted Chi Mak, a Chinese-born engineer working for a U.S. Navy defense contractor. Over the course of years, he had passed encrypted files to handlers. The files contained schematics, research on acoustic dampening, hull design, secrets of American submarine silence. It wasn't an isolated breach. By the late 2010s, Chinese cyber espionage efforts had harvested terabytes of classified data from U.S. shipbuilders and naval labs. While American defense agencies debated budgets and procurement delays, Beijing simply copied the future, piece by silent piece, and then they improved it. The Chinese Type XXI UN-class diesel-electric submarine was a turning point. Equipped with air-independent propulsion, it could remain underwater for weeks without surfacing. But more concerning was its acoustic profile. During a joint NATO exercise in 2015, a Yuan-class sub was spotted tailing an American carrier group from inside the formation. No one had seen it enter. No one had heard it arrive. For a full 48 hours, it sat undetected, right under the most expensive warship on Earth. The silence gap, once measured in decades, had shrunk to decibels. China was building not just a submarine fleet, but an undersea strategy. Artificial intelligence-controlled sonar buoys now dot the South China Sea. Deep-sea listening posts are buried in the silt. Even their autonomous underwater drones are equipped with passive acoustic arrays designed to hunt, not with noise, but with absence. They learned the same lesson the Germans knew in 1944. A loud submarine is a dead submarine. And now, the ocean is full of ghosts. Back in the U.S., panic met pride. The Navy accelerated the SSN-X program, the next generation of silent hunter-killers. These new subs wouldn't just be quieter. They would be smart. AI-controlled ballast systems, adaptive hull skins that shift to absorb sonar, self-learning acoustic profiles that detect and eliminate their own mechanical noise in real time. But even as America raced ahead, naval war planners whispered a terrifying possibility. What if silence is no longer enough? Because in China's naval labs, a new weapon was being tested. Not a missile, not a torpedo, but an algorithm, a machine-learning sonar system trained not to hear submarines, but to hear the space around them, the water displacement, the thermal wake, the minor gravitational anomalies. It didn't detect presence. It detected disturbance. If it works, silence dies. For now, no one knows how far along that system is. The data is buried behind firewalls and fake companies. But one thing is clear. The race isn't over, and the irony is cruel. America, once the spy, is now the one being watched, and the submarines it built to disappear may soon be the ones being found. The Type XXI, born in the final days of a crumbling empire, is now reborn in a new one. But where Germany failed to deploy it in time, China may have succeeded. The future of undersea warfare isn't a bigger missile or a faster boat. It's the same thing it's always been, a war of whispers. And who can stay quiet the longest? There are no medals for silence. no parades for submariners who return from 100-day patrols with no confirmed kills, no press briefings for operations that never happened, in waters never named, under flags never flown. But silence, pure, weaponized silence, is what keeps nations breathing. And yet, for all its power, silence is a paradox. You can't see it. You can't prove it. You can only feel it, in the stillness of sonar rooms, in the sweat on an operator's brow when nothing appears on the screen, and in the haunted eyes of commanders who know the deadliest weapon is already out there, and they'll never hear it coming. That doctrine was born not in America, not in China, not even in Russia. It was born in a bomb crater outside Epernay, France, in 1944, where German engineers worked under air raids to weld the curved ribs of the Type XXI submarine. They weren't designing a weapon to kill ships. They were designing a vessel that would make the enemy guess. And 80 years later, the world still hasn't stopped guessing. In the Indo-Pacific today, U.S. submarines prowl deeper than ever, gliding beneath fiber-optic cables and Chinese sonar walls. Their presence is unconfirmed, their routes classified, yet their silence is louder than any declaration of force. They are there because they must be, because if they're not, someone else will be. But here lies the problem. Everyone is silent now. Chinese diesel subs run quiet on air-independent propulsion for weeks. Russian nuclear boats like the Boray A class have near-zero acoustic signatures. Even India and Australia are fielding stealth-enhanced designs. The oceans are no longer filled with the hum of machinery. They're filled with anxious quiet. Sonar technicians in Guam, Diego Garcia, Vladivostok, and Hainan now listen not for contacts, but for the absence of contact. This has led to the rise of a chilling concept in military circles: the submarine gap of awareness. It's not about who has more submarines. It's about who knows where theirs are, and who doesn't. There are whispered rumors in naval intelligence briefings about a Chinese sub that entered the Indian Ocean in 2022 and was never logged exiting, about an American fast attack sub that went radio silent during a training exercise and reappeared a week later near the Persian Gulf, refusing to explain where it had been. In a war where stealth is survival, knowledge becomes noise. That's why the future won't just belong to the quietest submarine. It will belong to the side that knows when silence has become a lie. To counter this, new strategies are emerging. Swarm drones that flood the ocean with micro-noise to mask submarine movement, decoy buoys that simulate acoustic signatures, underwater satellites that watch thermal plumes from reactor wake. It's a chessboard of fake echoes and deliberate silences. But even in this noise-crowded sea, the original lesson remains unchanged. Silence is power, but only if it's earned, only if it's built, bolt by bolt, circuit by circuit, with the understanding that even a single ping, a single slip, a single metallic creak could turn a predator into prey, and that lesson was never American. It was German. Born in desperation, forged in war, forgotten by victory, revived by rivals, and now embedded in the blueprint of every submarine from Norfolk to Shanghai. Today, at the Naval Undersea Warfare Center in Newport, Rhode Island, a single artifact sits in a glass case, the rusted frame of a Type XXI pressure hull ring, recovered from the wreck of U-251 after it was sunk in weapons testing in 1951. It's curved, efficient, silent. A reminder that the greatest weapon of the 20th century wasn't a missile or a bomb. It was a machine built to disappear. And in a world of endless surveillance, where the oceans grow more crowded and the threats more complex, disappearing is still the deadliest move of all.